Hi, everybody. I'm delighted to welcome you to the Science and Society meetings organized by Istanbul Commerce University. It's the ninth of our meeting series, and today's topic is migration. And I'm sure I'm not exaggerating when I'm saying that migration is one of the very defining issues of our days. And therefore, I'm sure a historical look, a historical lens, especially particularly to the first migration, will be really very challenging if you think about the migration and border policies and also academic discussions. So in that sense, I'm very pleased to introduce our distinguished speaker, Emeritus Professor Dawn Chatty'i. She is here with us, and I think Professor Yücel Uğurlu, our rector, is also present. Maybe he will make a short welcoming speech to us, and then we will continue with the presentation of Professor Dawn Chatty'i.
Okay. Thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Your Honor, Mrs. Dawn Chatty'i, and distinguished guests, I extend my warm greetings to all. Migration is one of the most important issue nowadays, and not only for today. It was really one of the very important issues of the world during the last centuries. But just now, for decades, the Middle East has been the scene of forced migrations, as we know, as we live day by day. People leave their homes because of civil wars, political turmoil, and international terrorism, among other things. Forced migration may also take place because of the creation of nation states also. Forced migration has continued well into the 21st century, as Syria's civil war has created the largest number of refugees since World War II, with other 5 million forced to flee the country and at least 7 million internally displaced. The history of forced migration has had a big impact in the entire Middle East, on its cultures and especially on the politics of the regions. Each time there is mass-scale forced migration, it changed the relationships among the countries and has a deep impact on the individual countries involved. As a consequence, labor markets are affected not only in the home country of the refugees, but also in the host country. Not only it's related to labor, of course, it is related to culture, social problems, economic problems. It causes, of course, and difficulties for the people who are the subject of migration. Such influxes also improve the institutional and political environment of the host country, as existing institutions and the political system are forced to cope with the influx of refugees. Furthermore, cross-cultural political relationships are strengthened in the long run, as the countries have to learn to work together to handle the major displacement of the people. Therefore, it is clear that this presentation will give us several insights about the forced migration. It is historical background and will open up new academic discussions. By the way, I would like to remind a small point, a little point. I would like to emphasize it. We met with Ms. Chatty at Cambridge University. It was, I think, 9 months ago. It was about migration issue also. It was directly related to the Mid East problems, migration problems. She honestly declared all her opinions about the migration in previous centuries. She talked about Crimea, she talked about Caucasia and Balkan region, and I thought this is the right person who will talk frankly, honestly to all of us. And I'm sure we will learn a lot of things from her experiences from her thoughts. Thank you very much for accepting our invitation. I don't want to take your time anymore. Thank you very much again.
Okay, thank you, Professor Uğurlu, for your welcoming speech. Now I just want to share a brief bio of our Professor Chatty. Professor Dawn Chatty is a social anthropologist whose ethnographic interests lie in the Middle East, particularly with nomadic pastoral tribes and refugee young people. Professor Chatty is both an academic anthropologist and practitioner, having carefully developed her career in universities in the United States, Lebanon, Syria, and Oman, as well as with a number of development agencies such as UNDP and UNICEF. After taking her undergraduate degree with honors at UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles, she took a master's degree in development studies from the Institute of Social Studies, The Hague, Netherlands. Then she returned to UCLA to take her PhD in social anthropology under the late Professor Hilde Cooper. Following the award of Leverhulme Major Research Fellowship, Dawn Chatty spent the period between 2007 and 2005 and 7 researching and writing the manuscript on dispossession and forced migration in the Middle East. The volume was published by Cambridge University Press in May 2010, and then in 2016 she had another volume entitled with Syria, the Making and Unmaking of a Refugee State, published by Oxford University Press. It's a really amazing, impressive CV. Thank you again for joining us and expecting our invitations, Professor Chatty. Just practical information before the session gets started. At the chat box, all our audiences can ask their questions and comments to the chat box. We are all invited. And after Professor Chatty's presentation, I try to collect some questions and comments and try to directly forward them. And hopefully we will get a very fruitful discussion. The floor is yours, Professor Chatty.
Okay. Let's see. I'm just going to try and share my screen.
Yes.
And from the beginning. There we go. Okay. So thank you both. I'm really very appreciative to this invitation, which was extended to me in October of last year, and actually was originally scheduled for March 23rd in Istanbul. So this is a replacement. Anyway, I hope someday to be back in Istanbul. For today, what I would like to do is ask you to keep in mind that the question that I am asking is, why might a look at our past be helpful in unpacking the challenges and possibilities of contemporary migration governance? So I just quote briefly from Shakespeare, The Tempest, where Antonio tells Sebastian, "Whereof what's past is prologue." In other words, the past can inform our present and set out our future. And in that vein, I want to revisit our past in order to understand how what has been done in the past might help us to consider the future. I start with some definitions. I think most academics start with some sort of definitions. I think we need to keep in mind what we mean when we talk about a displaced person, a refugee, or an IDP, an internally displaced person, or an asylum seeker. And I think we need to keep clear in our mind that before World War II, so before the middle of the 20th century, when we still had colonial empires in the West, but they were crumbling and coming to an end, the definition of a forced migrant or a displaced person didn't really matter. But the contemporary humanitarian aid regime, which started after World War II, it matters a lot. So today I want to explore, in the course of this presentation, whether the contemporary migration humanitarian response to mass forced migration might be an outgrowth of the imperial and colonial past, or largely an abrupt disjunction from the past. So again, I ask the question, can we learn from past practice how to better manage mass migration, reception, integration, and general governance. So, as I said, in the 19th century and in the early 20th century, frontiers were fuzzy. Movement was rarely restricted, particularly not in imperial encounters with multiculturalism and ethnic diversity. And this was the case in the Ottoman Empire, but also in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, as well as in the colonies, particularly held by the European nations of England, France, Belgium, and so on. However, in the 19th century, there was a counter movement, hegemonic and homogeneous nation-state building movement that was also at work. And it resulted in conflict, in mass forced migration, in ethnic cleansing. Some people would even say in ethnic genocide, and the homogenization of subjects of new nation states, very much in the kind of imagined community of Benedict Anderson. However, of all these different colonial and imperial encounters, the Ottoman Empire was uniquely challenged to consider and implement systems of refuge, of resettlement, of re-territorialization in order to address, organize, and manage the mass influx of people on its borders, from its borderland into the heartland of the empire, into Anatolia and into its southern provinces. But it was also uniquely the one state at that time which did not essentialize the tying of culture or ethnicity to territory. And I think this is an important key to understanding why it was so successful. So in my presentation, I'm going to talk through some of these definitions. I'm going to move on and talk about the Nansen Doctrine after World War I. And I will also look at the modern system that emerged after the 1951 Geneva Convention, or Refugee Convention, we call it, on the status of refugees. And then I'm going to look back at the Ottoman legacy and consider how today's system of managing forced migration might have roots and precedences, but also ruptures from this Ottoman past. So let's just look at a few definitions. It's all social groups create descriptive frames, categories, typologies of people. Human beings as social beings see themselves and others. It's a way of organizing how we view our surroundings and others who are not like us. But so the questions we need to ask is, who is a forced migrant? What is the distinction between a forced and a voluntary migrant? Who is a refugee? In legal terms or in common everyday parlance? Someone who is not like us, the other. Anthropologists often talk about the self and the other, and the way in which ethnicities and minorities, insiders, outsiders emerge. And of course, these concepts were taken forward by the work of Giorgio Agamben, the Italian philosopher, in his seminal work on Homo Sacer, the outsider who can be killed with no consequence because he's not part of the social group. Now, in international law, or I should say within the United Nations system, we have two definitions of refugees. One is the definition created by the United Nations Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, which, as you all know, sees a person who, owing to a well-founded fear of being persecuted for reasons of race, religion, nationality, membership of a particular social group or political opinion, is unable or unwilling because of such fear to avail themselves of the protection of that country. So basically a person who has lost the protection of their own state. Within this definition, you have asylum seeker, people who are seeking to be recognized by the UN system as refugees. But then you also have internally displaced people and other people of concern, including stateless people. All of these come under the rubric of the United Nations High Commission for Refugees. There is, of course, another definition, which is an operational definition, which the United Nations Agency for Palestine Refugees has put into effect and recognizes these as people who were in a particular territory at a particular time in Palestine between June of 1946 and May of 1948. Also as refugees. So we have a number of definitions of refugees, but the point I just want to make very quickly is that A refugee or refugee is not a label for a special, generalizable kind or type of person. It's a descriptive rubric, a descriptive guide that includes within it a world of socioeconomic statuses, of personal histories, and psychological situations. I'm going to start with the modern era and break that down into 5 phases, and then we'll go back and look at the 19th century. So it's very common now to break down the history of the refugee regime into first phase 1, which emerged during and after World War I. It was the time at the end of the Russian, the Austro-Hungarian, and the Ottoman Empire, and the creation of the League of Nations. Phase 2, I'll talk about in more detail, comes at the end of World War II, when Europe suddenly had to deal with more than 40 million displaced people, because at this point we didn't have a particular definition for refugee. Phase 3 comes in, I would say, at the end of the colonial era, as the US was pulling out of Vietnam, as Britain and France and other Western countries were pulling out of Africa. Phase 4 is what I call during the Cold War, a period when very complex emergencies began to develop. And phase 5, which we are in now, I call this the fortress mentality period, also the period of the asylum migration nexus, where asylum and migration get very much blurred. So just looking at the first phase of this era, this is the period when the first High Commissioner for Refugees was appointed. This was Fridtjof Nansen, a Norwegian, an explorer, a scientist, a diplomat, and he served as the first High Commissioner and very, very quickly saw that the biggest problem that Europe or the Western world was facing was that there were so many displaced people in Europe, particularly from Russia, and many of them had been denationalized by Lenin in 1921. So they had no identity papers. They were stuck. They couldn't move. They couldn't cross borders. And his solution was to create a document, which was called the Nansen Passport. And it was the first legal instrument for the international protection of refugees. With this document, you could cross a border to go and look for work, and you could also come back. And for this work and for other things that he did earlier in terms of the famines after World War I, he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1938, basically for his passport that allowed refugees to move around. The second phase, which emerged after World War II, and very much an outcome of the terrible tragedies of World War II, I would say the most important document that first emerged was the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and I just identify Article 13, which states that, Article 14, everyone has the right to seek and enjoy in other countries asylum from persecution. This declaration was not a treaty, so it was really up to individuals to integrate this declaration into the basic principles that governed how they managed the movement of people. And with these 40 million displaced people in Europe and more than 1 million refugees, displaced people who refused to be repatriated, the primary solution that the international humanitarian aid system put into place at that time was third country resettlement. So by 1951, we had the Geneva Convention for Refugees from Europe. And at that point, refugees became separated from economic migrants. Their status was protected by international law. And once their status was agreed, the third country resettlement was undertaken by a second agency created by the international system, which was called the Provisional Intergovernmental Committee for the Movement of Migrants from Europe. And this was the agency which then identified and arranged for the transport of millions of migrants during the 1950s, primarily to Latin America, but also to other countries. The reasoning behind having an agency to recognize refugees and another agency to actually move them and resettle them was, at that time, there was a huge fear that if we had too many displaced people in displaced people's camps, they could become radicalized, that it was dangerous to keep people in these kind of camps. So it was best to move them on and to disperse them as soon as possible. So forward migration was a very important part of phase 2. Phase 3 was the Cold War and the post-colonial era. It was also the time when the UN system recognized that the Geneva Convention, which was temporal and territorial, it only related to refugees from Europe after World War II, had to be extended, and the 1967 protocol was put into place, removing the temporal and also the territorial restrictions on who may or may not become a refugee. This is an image of Checkpoint Charlie in a divided Berlin, and many refugees from behind the Iron Curtain, which was in place during the Cold War, were largely welcomed and seen as heroes escaping from communism. So were greeted as honorable exiles, if I can put it that way. Also, the provisional interagency migration intergovernmental committee was renamed into an intergovernmental committee for European migrants, and then eventually that became the IOM that we know, and it continued now to process, even in the 1960s and 1970s, more than 500,000 displaced people, refugees, and also economic migrants from Europe to overseas countries. Again, many highly qualified migrants were helped through IOM to go to Latin America. The fourth phase in the 1990s, I call it the phase of the new wars, of the many shaded kind of refugees. The definition of who is a refugee in these kind of wars became very complicated. Sometimes people were no longer just fleeing a political system, as during the Cold War, but they were people fleeing for safety, for family reunification, and for security. And this is an image from Sarajevo in 1992 as non-state actors, as the security services try to protect civilians from non-state actors. Now we're in what I would call phase 5. We haven't been able to get out of that. This is the current sort of fortress mentality, try and keep asylum seekers and refugees away, manage them far away, and also blur the definition of who is a forced migrant, who might be an economic migrant, and so on. Throughout Europe, certainly an antipathy to forced migrants, even when it's people being targeted in armed conflict. Europe becomes particularly concerned in this blurring between an asylum seeker and a migrant, and the term bogus asylum seeker. It becomes very popular, particularly in some of the national presses. Many of the populists start talking about keep people out. That becomes the discourse. Somehow that refugees and migrants become a security risk. Doesn't matter if they're actually the victims of armed conflict and oppression, still being regarded as a security risk. Certainly by the first decade of the 21st century, we begin to see that the security of the Mediterranean becomes very important with border patrols and open sea operations, not so much to save people, but to push them back. We're still seeing very much of that. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a reason why the Mediterranean has been so much in our focus. I just wanted to play up here to show you again the huge rise in the number of refugees and displaced persons, even since the mid-1970s, when the UNHCR felt it had a responsibility to just 2.5 million. Of course, the numbers jump in the 1990s, and this is, I think, because of the crushing failure of the collapse of Yugoslavia and the wars in the Balkans. It jumps again after the Iraq crisis, and now we see it as nearly 72, maybe 73 million people of concern. The actual number for refugees is that are recognized by the UNHCR is only about 27 million. I say only about, they're still huge numbers. But the Mediterranean is really the focus of many of these numbers. I've tried to show you here how if you include Palestinian refugees, then perhaps the number of refugees on the Mediterranean rim comes closer to 45, 50% of all of the world's refugees. Obviously, this is critical, and the UN has tried to move with the times to figure out how to deal with this kind of mass influx. And that resulted in September 2016, the United Nations General Assembly unanimously adopting the UN Declaration for Refugees and Migrants. And then in 2018, the UN adopted the Global Compact on Refugees, of which only 2 nations voted against, and that was the United States and Hungary. And a comprehensive plan of action was put into place. Now, why is it we have this huge migration on the Mediterranean rim? Where did it all begin? So this is where I take you now into a history. And I feel a little bit uncomfortable talking about this history to a largely Turkish audience. And I'm sure you'll have a lot of questions to ask. I'll try and deal with them as best I can. And if I make too many broad generalizations, just bear with me. I'm trying to get a lot of ideas across in just a few minutes. So the 19th century was really a time when the political project coming from Europe was to unmix and create homogeneous nation states. This came into contact and into conflict, I would say, into a crunch with the Ottoman Empire, where identity at that time was based very much on ethno-religious ties. So within the millet system, you had Muslims who could be Arabs, they could be Kurds, they could be Albanians, Turks, Kosovars. You had Christians who could also be Arabs or Greeks or Armenians or Serbians, Bulgarians even, and Jews. So belonging was not based only on your birthplace, but specifically included the social community, the ethno-religious community, or the millet. And these religious hierarchies were dispersed throughout the Ottoman Empire and not in one particular place. So I say again, the Ottoman Empire was the one state that didn't essentialize culture and ethnicity as being tied specifically to territory. So with this unmixing based on territory that was coming from Europe, there was bound to be some significant problems. You know from your history that in the unmixing, you had Greece becoming a kingdom of Greece in 1832, and then Bulgaria, Serbia, Montenegro in 1878, and then Thessaly, Crete, Macedonia, etc. So the result of all of these states being created either on the edges of the Ottoman Empire resulted in massive flight of Muslims to the remaining parts of the Ottoman Empire, particularly, I'm going to say, to Anatolia and the southern territories. Now, when the flight was limited, the Ottomans dealt with it very easily. So I'm just going to look at some of the armed conflicts of the beginning and the middle of the 19th century, which began as a response to French colonial expansion and retreat, particularly into Egypt, of which the Ottoman Empire responded by sending Muhammad Ali, an Ottoman military officer of Albanian descent, to Egypt to reoccupy it after this brief period of French occupation between 1798 and 1801. Muhammad Ali retook Egypt and then the Hijaz, and then he moved into Bilad al-Sham, and by 1832 he had actually taken all of Syria as well as Anatolia, and Europe became very nervous. So that became the first crisis of the Ottomans within the Comity of Nations of Europe. That was called the Oriental Crisis of 1840, with Great Britain, Russia, Austria-Hungary, and later France insisting on Muhammad Ali withdrawing and going back to Egypt, and they would allow him hereditary rule in Egypt. So that the few thousands of people displaced quickly returned. Following from that was the French expedition into Algeria, which was the invasion, and then a very long struggle against the colonial invasion led by the Emir Abdul Qadir. He lost, was exiled to France, and eventually Napoleon III agreed to let him return to his region, asked him, where do you want to go? Everybody thought he would ask to go to Istanbul, but surprisingly, he said Damascus. So he came to Damascus with 5,000 of his soldiers and supporters, and he's very famous for his role in shutting down the incipient Christian massacre in Damascus of 1860. However, these were smallish, I'm going to say smallish numbers of people. They were in the thousands and easily absorbed into the receiving territory. But when the numbers were hundreds of thousands, half millions, millions, how did the Ottoman Empire respond? So a few quick examples. I'm sure you're very well aware of them. I would say the first really large out-migration from the borderlands was from the Crimea at the end of the Crimean War of 1853 to 1856, which was fought by the British, the French, and the Ottomans against Russia for a number of reasons. 500,000 of the Muslims of Crimea, the Tatars, along with another 500,000 Cossacks from Georgia and Ukraine today, were pushed out. The Russians did not want them on their borderland. So you had 1 million Muslims pushed out from the borderland, forced out under the terms of the Treaty of Paris in 1856. So they had to leave. So following on from the Crimea, you had in the 1860s, particularly after the defeat of Sheikh Shamil, the Chechnyan leader, another 500,000 to 1 million, again, forced out, going into the Balkans, some of them coming into Anatolia. So that was another million. And then between the 1860s and the 1890s, a second wave of about 1 to 2 million, mainly Caucasians, leaving for fear of being forced to convert to Russian Orthodoxy. So over, I would say, 2-3 decades, you had 3 to 4 million people forced out from their borderland areas into the Ottoman Empire. I just take a minute because so many of these forced migrants were Circassian, Chechnyan, Dagestani. I just focus them on for a moment because the Ottoman response really was to this wave initially. The Circassians were always kind of romanticized by the Europeans. There was this notion of the Circassians having a tremendous military prowess. They were an important fighting force for Ottoman militias, and the Russians demanded that they had to be moved away from their borders. The women were always identified as being particularly beautiful and part of the Seraglio in Constantinople. So Europeans were certainly watching what was happening in that place. So with the mass influx of the 1850s and 1860s, the concern of the Sublime Porte in Constantinople was not how do we stop these numbers of people from coming, but how do we integrate and resettle? How can we use these numbers in the most beneficial way in our empire? How do we use them to develop our underpopulated areas and also our more insecure regions? So the Ottoman response was a decentralized approach to dealing with these huge numbers. They dispersed people as quickly as possible to provincial areas and sought to find ways of integrating the migrants as new subjects of the empire. So it was a matter of integration and not assimilation into the multicultural Ottoman Empire. So these forced migrants were relocated to agricultural areas where tax farming had become very weak in order to try and reinvigorate the tax farming. They were also sent to settle in areas of local conflict, in border areas, particularly in the southern provinces, in areas of conflict between Bedouin and Kurds, between Druze and Bedouin, and so on. And then in the later waves, they were also sent to areas where new technology could be used to create more settlement in areas where the Hijaz Railroad was coming in, and also areas where swamp drainage had become possible with new technology. So in 1857, the Ottoman government instituted the Refugee Code. Some people call it the Immigration Code. I think in Ottoman Turkish, the immigrant and the refugee are both referred to in the same term as some form of muhajir or muhajirun. These families were given plots of land. They were exempted from taxation. The young men in the families were also exempted from conscription for a period of 6 years if their resettlement was in the Balkans, in the Rumeli, but for 12 years if the resettlement was in Anatolia or in Syria. On top of that, these refugees or immigrants were promised freedom of religion, whatever their faith. They were permitted to construct their own places of worship. All they had to promise was that they would not sell the land that they were given for at least 20 years. Now, whether that was to prevent land speculation or to stop people from moving to the cities is probably another issue for a historical professor to look at. The Ottoman also advertised. They advertised in newspapers in Europe, in North America, and they received significant responses from Hungary, from Bohemia, from Poland, from Switzerland, Italy, and even from the United States. By the mid-19th century, it was very clear that the Ottomans had created I'm going to say, a liberal and tolerant policy to forced migrants. Some of that had been developed before the huge waves of migrants. And the very good example of that is the outcome of the 1848-49 Hungarian uprising, where as many as 16,000 soldiers and others from Transylvania fled upon their defeat and came into the Ottoman Empire. Of course, the Austro-Hungarians insisted that these people be returned, but the Ottomans took the position that, well, these people have taken refuge with us and their extradition and surrender will not be considered, but we will move them away from the frontier and keep them in a secure place, similar to what they later on were to promise with regards to the Circassians. Now, this is contrary to what was policy at the time, that most treaties at the time insisted on the return of political exiles, military personnel who had fled, etc. In one of the memoirs written at the time, there was the statement that this policy was based on Muslim principles, the duty to provide sanctuary, and that position greatly enhanced the Ottoman state's reputation as a member of the European Comity of Nations, which included France and Great Britain, especially as France and Great Britain were opposed to Austria-Hungary at the time. But this move towards the agreement to be part of the Comity of Nations was then absolutely codified at the end of I think it was in 1860s. So the Ottoman Empire was very much a member of equals with Great Britain and France at the time. Now, I just point out here some of the settlement of the Circassians and Chechens, which was, of course, in Anatolia, but I was really interested in the displacement of the settlements here along the borderland between agriculture and pastoral herding, and also areas where there was constant conflict between the local communities. And so the Circassians were used instrumentally, you can say, but they were also following the Ottoman principle of dispersing people, not allowing single colonies to form, and creating barriers between local enemy groups, which eventually won the respect of local populations. Obviously, the Ottoman response changed over time as the economy changed, as land pressure changed, and as the Ottomans needed to move into areas that were empty because of malaria. They also used the Circassians to drain swamps in the area around Alexandretta and also in Palestine. The Refugee Code eventually became a commission, a general administration, and as I said earlier, it remained fairly liberal, rather generous and open. It certainly helped economically. It repopulated underpopulated agricultural areas in the Ottoman Empire. Politically, it was very useful to defend frontiers, but also it revived the military, as many of the Circassians previously the Poles and the Hungarians had become Ottoman army officers, but then many Circassians did too. And environmentally, it was also quite interesting in the way that it turned swampland into productive land, and also land that was suitable for tax farming. One of your very well-known historians, Kemal Karpat, states at this point that this was the first instance of direct, prolonged, and rational state social planning in the Muslim world, and probably the first of its kind in the world to regulate immigration and devise a coherent settlement policy. The emphasis was on the short emergency stage and then a long developmental or integration stage, if I can put it that way. I want to speed up. I'm running out of time. This is the second wave that occurred in the 1880s. Another 1 to 2 million Circassians were being forced to move away from the borderlands as a result of the Treaty of Berlin in 1878. So the general administration for refugees and immigrants was very useful in settling the second wave. Most of it was very successful, although there were a few Chechnyan groups that settled on the border between what is today Syria and Turkey who weren't happy and returned to Chechnya. So overall, we have now by the 1880s, this General Administration for Refugee Affairs, which was very well organized to provide assistance to locate land for resettlement, to transport the immigrants to these lands, giving them housing, seeds, etc., if they needed them, and in some cases even providing winter heating and supplies for the first year of their presence there. This continued up until the end of the, as we enter World War I, the end of the Ottoman Empire, and now we have the end of the Refugee Commission, and a period, a sort of I'm going to call it a very vague period between about 1918 and 1920-21, before Nansen began his work again, where Kemal Atatürk's push to modernize meant that he did not want to employ any imperial Ottoman institutions in the new republic, but still it appeared that he saw integration and protection of forced migrants as based on certain principles that were probably inherited from the Ottoman Empire, especially in terms of resettlement policies. So for a few years, there was nothing to replace these kind of policies until the League of Nations appointed Fritold Nansen as the first Refugee High Commissioner. And he, if you think back to what I pointed out about his legacy, he immediately developed tools for the Nansen era that had been practiced before in the Ottoman Empire. So in a way, you could say we came full circle. The Nansen era clearly identified that the emergency phase of a crisis needed to be short, and that forced migrants also needed to quickly become, if you want, self-sufficient economic migrants who could support themselves and thus contribute to the development of their adopted state. This is what came into play between World War I and World War II, and it was clearly drawn from the practices of the 19th century Ottoman state, which saw integrating refugees and immigrants as quickly as possible in order for them to become self-sufficient as imperative. So I will just take a few minutes, this is my last slide, to just question whether we're looking now today at imperial precedents or ruptures. So what can we learn from this Ottoman period? Clearly, the Ottoman state saw the necessity of moving from the emergency to the resettlement development phase rapidly. Clearly, the Ottoman state saw immigrants and refugees as potential citizens, as taxpayers through tax farming for the state. They saw an economic potential to revive tax farming as the new immigrants became self-sufficient. The Ottomans also saw technology, the draining of swamps, as a key for resettlement in underpopulated areas where malaria thrived. And they also were determined to prevent the formation of colonies or ghettos by encouraging a form of local cosmopolitanism, or I'm going to say local conviviality, by dispersing ethnic groups throughout what remained of the Ottoman Empire. But in the Middle East today, we have a general rejection of the 1951 Geneva Convention, except for Turkey, which has accepted the 51 Convention, but has maintained the territorial restriction for refugees coming from Europe. And this, I would say that general rejection is in favor of what might be called an Ottoman precedent, the duty to provide protection. So there is a preference in the region to look at forced migrants, to classify them as temporary guests or as temporary workers rather than as refugees, and to attempt to promote some kind of self-sufficiency, number one. And number two, there's a recognition throughout the region of the obligation to assist, to provide hospitality, and in that sense, I say also amongst the refugees, there is a sense of an obligation to return the gift by becoming self-sufficient and contributing to society, whether it's through paying taxes or other means of giving something back to those who've been generous to you. Now, these are all features which I think, in the 21st century could do well to consider. The Global Compact on Refugees makes a few uncertain steps in that direction, but it's still based on the notion of containing refugees in place rather than mobility, dispersal, and efforts to help people to become self-sufficient. So in this last image, I think I've covered most of these points. Certainly the ruptures that we see today is the liberal open policy of the Ottomans has been replaced by a fortress mentality of containment, which is still present in the Global Compact of 2018. And again, the economic and political benefit of both refugees and migrants is not acknowledged in most countries, nor do many countries recognize their social, some will say religious obligation to assist the needy and undervalued. And I'll stop here. I've gone a little bit over time, but hopefully there's time for questions or discussion.
Sure, of course. Thank you, Professor Chatty. I just want to leave the floor to Professor Oğurlu. If you have some questions or comments, we can start with you and then we'll continue with other questions and comments.
First of all, I would like to thank you. It was really great speech. As I said in the very beginning, we learned a lot of things during your conference. Thank you very much for this great information, knowledge, and I am sure we learned not only knowledge and information, and you have a lot of wisdom. We are learning still from you. As I said before, we would like to host you here face to face, inshallah. As you said, inshallah, I am repeating it. I think you are fluent in Arabic also. I don't have any question, but I emphasize that, and I would like to thank again about the information that you gave us about Caucasian migration, Crimea and Balkan region. It is mostly forgotten side of the migration history. I am one of the descendants of these Caucasian migrants, and also Biris Karacay.
Yes, of course, yeah. From the
we are from their descendants, and there are millions of people who are the descendants of those people from Caucasia, Crimea, and Balkan region. We believe that all these migration stories are tragedy. We believe, of course, you don't forget it in your mind during the generations. The trauma is really very deep. Because of that, we can easily understand what's happening now in Middle East, in other parts of the world, because we have a deep empathy with the other people who are the subject of migration. Thank you very much. Again, I don't have any question. I leave a stage to real expert. Thank you.
Professor Orlu. Thank you for your contribution. We are very kind. Professor Chatty, I have some ice-breaking question if we get some questions and comments from audiences. For a while, I just want to make a little start. I read your papers and books, and I'm really very fascinated from your research. And in those papers, I realized you mentioned about the conditional hospitality and the hostility. So there is some sort of pendulum between this conditional hospitality and hostility, which is also mentioned by Derrida. This is really very interesting. I think you can trace back this issue with the Ottoman Empire. You can give some examples from the Ottoman Empire. It's really very great example for this presentation for us, for all of us. But as also today, if you look at today, if you look at today's conditions and today's migration panorama, we also see the same conditional hospitality as well as the hostility, and especially on both sides. Again, in the West and in the East, we see this type of conditional hospitality. But for now on, the hospitality has been moved towards hostility with the populist policies and with other things going on the European side. I'm curious whether there is any possibility to have some comprehensive or holistic approach to come up with those, hostility approach, because we need some humanitarian assistance. We need much more effective humanitarian assistance, which could be lead to the Syrians, which is the most important case. But those humanitarian assistance are not much effective. And this hospitality and hostility paradigm is there, and there isn't any comprehensive approach. Is it possible to reach to those type of approaches? This is my icebreaking question for the start of the session.
Well, you really raise a very important issue. Comprehensive plans take a long time to put into effect. I often refer to the biggest comprehensive plan of action, which came into effect in 1989, 1990 for the Vietnamese and Laotian boat people. It took 15 years to be negotiated. 15 years, but once it was negotiated, it was comprehensive. How was it comprehensive? It was comprehensive because it negotiated the return of some Vietnamese who maybe were afraid to go back and live under the communism because they had been fleeing communism, but their return in safety and security was guaranteed by the United Nations system. So there was some return, and there was some negotiated integration in the places where they were in refugee camps, like in Malaysia, in Thailand, etc. And there was third country resettlement. 1 million of the Vietnamese then were dispersed around the world. Something like 45 different countries took numbers. And that has been extremely, has been truly successful. There have been some other similar plans in Central America under Sarifka. And I actually believe that we need to see something like that now for not only Syrians in Turkey, but there, we're close to 4 million Syrians in Turkey. The population of Syrians in Turkey is 4 times higher than the population of Syrians in Germany.
Yeah.
Okay. So it's not tenable. It's obvious. Hospitality generally is temporary. So now we've gone 8-9 years into this temporary state. So hospitality, it's not surprising that it turns into hostility in some cases, not in all cases, but in many cases. And also, politicians can use this and inflame hostility, or they can dampen it. But the point is, the numbers are too great to ask any one nation to manage. So there needs to be some kind of a plan. And that's why I'm so against the fortress mentality that we have emerging from Europe, which is basically, well, you keep them there and we just throw money at you, or we create bilateral agreements. So there, I think that, there are Syrians in Turkey, there are Afghan, there are Iranian, there are many different groups. It's not only Syrians, but the point is that having barriers does not solve the problem. It only makes things worse. So there needs to be some kind of a negotiation for a comprehensive plan.
As far as I remember, Professor Chatty, the United Nations Agency for Refugees has initiated this type of plans. Yes, this comprehensive plan of action. And Sergio Viono de Mello was the head of this, plan. And he, for him, he took, I think, more than 15 years or 20 years to implement all those plans and take those initiatives. And he was bombed by in Iraq, so it's a really very difficult and also dangerous, case to handle it. So, and if you also mentioned this United Nations plan, Global Compact on Refugees. This is also an inspiring plan, but at the end, if you look at the agenda, you will see that they are not against the containment of the refugees. It's also not much acceptable. So how is it possible to move forward with those type of, efforts coming from the UN side and also coming from the EU side with the Fortress Europe and externalization policies?
Yeah, it's well, you're absolutely right. I agree with you 100%. The global compact, the compact of 2018 for refugees, I believe is the UN's response to refugees from Syria. These huge numbers. It doesn't give any protection. There's no international protection, and there's no possibility of moving elsewhere. It basically is freezing the refugees where they are. I mean, in Africa, in many of the states in Africa, it looks like it might be a good package because it's offering development assistance, but actually it's offering, what I'm going to say, the same kind of neo-colonial development assistance, because it's not really helping to develop the economy of the country other than basically helping Europe. So I think we have to find ways of moving beyond the global compact, because the global compact on refugees does not really solve any problem. It's throwing a temporary towel, to somebody drowning. It's not, it just doesn't move far enough, because it's only really providing assistance as long as the refugees stay in the country that they're in now, stay in the neighboring country. So I mean, I don't despair, because I'm sure there's somebody else like Sergio de Mello around working on trying to, if somebody, the big problem with the 4 million in Syria is that we need to negotiate not just with the Syrian government, but with Russia and with Iran. That, maybe we had to create a UN security force to arrange for 500,000 Syrians to go back to Syria, but to be protected from not being disappeared or treated as a traitor, because the Syrian Assad's government considers anybody who left the country as a traitor. So those who have come back, many people have been pushed back from Lebanon. Some have gone back voluntarily to see if they can possibly live there. Some of them end up being arrested. Some of them end up being, they don't know what's happened to them. So the UN system, if you want to have a comprehensive plan of action, it has to include that people can go back. And since the cause of the fighting has not ended, and there's, as you know, not only is there fighting in Idlib in the north, but there is a lot of fighting in Daraa in the south that people don't like to talk about. So there's still a lot of violence from armed groups and the state reacting. Russians are trying to manage. So a comprehensive plan of action has to be really international, and it has to include that a significant number of people who are willing to go back to Syria can go back in safety. There are many middle-class Syrians in Lebanon and in Istanbul. I was in Istanbul in March before the COVID became, there are parts of Fatih and other areas of Istanbul that have a lot of Syrian businesses, so there's some who may think, I'd rather, if I can, build a new life here, I would stay, but not 4 million. and then the world also has to take up its responsibility and absorb the migrants. Europe needs migrants. So whether they're refugees or migrants, it can't maintain a fortress mentality while it has such an aging population. I mean, there's serious economic issues that have to be addressed. And I hope it will happen, but we need to wait for the political pendulum to swing away from this kind of populist discourse to something a little bit more reasonable, I hope, in the next round of elections.
Yeah, okay. Thank you so much, Professor Chatty. Then the Ruben Anderson's article about the industry of the European borders, he also mentions about those, profit gaining from the borders and all those companies and agencies who are really wanting to contain migrants along the borders because they are really gaining much more money. So having them and integrating them into the country is much more problematic for them, but they prefer having more profits. So it's also one other issue that I would like to highlight. So his article, Ruben Anderson and in the industry of European borders. And another issue that I have in my mind. So the Syrian diaspora in Europe, does it, or the other non-governmental organization in Europe, can they make some changes or some revisions in line with this, political debates? If you think about this populist, uprisings as well.
That's a tough one. I'll start with what I call the border frontier economy. Yes, there's some very interesting work. Also, Ruben Anderson has written. I think he calls it Illegality Inc.
Yes,
Incorporated.
Yes.
There is a real economy about border control, border securitization. Just like there's a war economy in Syria that's very difficult to stop. People make a lot of money from these kind of fragile. Well, it's not actually a fragile state, but these kind of terrorizing states. And so, ending a war economy is as difficult really as ending the kind of economy that exists with on the borders. That's always a difficult issue, but it takes political will. I think the political will has to come first. And, we're in a period where Europe is in terrible flux. I mean, the Brexit is such a big mistake, but I think something very, very ugly was happening in 2016, and I think it won't happen again. But I think there was terrible manipulation and interference in elections in Europe, in England, in the United States in 2016, which I don't think can be repeated, because I think people are much more aware. So we need to see some kind of a change. And I think it's coming. The Syrian diaspora, if I understood your question correct, there is a very active Syrian diaspora. I mean, you have to keep in mind that from the time that the Ba'ath Party came into control in some people say 1967, some people say 1970, when Hafez al-Assad took over, it only took a few years for many intelligent Syrians to realize that their lives were going to be crushed. And Syrians began leaving. So they would go abroad for education and then not come back. And this is particularly clear with Syrian doctors. Many Syrian doctors went to the United States and stayed there. So today you have, I think it's called SAMS, the Syrian American Medical Association, or maybe it's SAMA, very, very active in trying to provide humanitarian relief, and also trying to have a voice. But they have a humanitarian voice, and they certainly send a lot of remittances back to keep people alive in the country, but they don't have a political voice. Most of them have been very outspoken against what the government has been doing for the last 10 years, but they've been outspoken from even before. So in that way, the diaspora economically is important. And they're very active. I mean, I think in places where Syrians in Europe and in the United States and Canada have settled, it doesn't take very long before any hostility, any animosity to them disappears. They're very energetic. I mean, they come from merchant backgrounds most of the time, and are hospitably treated and integrate. So it's a tough one. I'm not sure. In many other long, armed conflicts, the diaspora is very active, but politically, you know, the both Hafiz al-Assad and Bashar al-Assad have completely squashed any political opposition.
Yeah, that's great. And another question, if I think about your presentation, the Ottoman past, and now we are looking at the Turkish policies towards Syria, do you think that Turkey's military involvement within the Syrian war can bring stability or peace to the region? Are there any examples coming from the history in that sense? Is it possible to make some more comments about this issue as well?
This is really a very difficult question. Okay. Turkey is very worried about its southern border. You know, in this part of Syria, you have many Kurds. Some of them are Kurds who came to Syria in the 1920s when they fled after the unsuccessful Sheikh Said revolt in Turkey. They're very active. They're almost semi-autonomous, semi-independent, and according to your prime minister, they're a threat to Turkey. I'm not so sure. I think that most of the Syrian Kurds are interested in negotiating a kind of recognized semi-autonomy within Syria, with permission and acceptance of their language and their culture and their music, etc., etc. And there's a lot of negotiation taking place there. Maybe there is still, in some people's mind, a threat that the Kurds might form a single nation. I don't think that's the case. But I think what Turkey needs to reconsider, and what it was doing at the beginning, was maintaining an open border. Syrians could flee, they could register, they could get cards to access health and education. It was a very, very generous policy. On top of that, Turkey allowed some kind of opposition to set itself up in Gaziantep. But on top of that, it allowed the international humanitarian system to use this border. Well, it's not that close to the border, but this region, Gaziantep, in order to provide humanitarian assistance to the 3 or 4 million Syrians that are in the Idlib province. Now, I think they're talking about shutting down these borders, the two border crossings, in order to allow this humanitarian assistance to come in. Or maybe it's not so much Turkey, it's the Security Council hasn't been able to agree to allow these two border crossings to remain. So internationally, that's one space. But I think that Erdogan can say, we have a humanitarian obligation to allow assistance to come to these people who are stuck there. You know, I'm sure that if there are enough troops, that these civilians shouldn't just be sacrificed because of the fact that the Syrian government has been allowing the defeated opposition fighters all to go into Idlib. There's still a huge number of civilians who need humanitarian assistance, and really the only way for that assistance to come through is through Turkey. So
thank you, Professor Chetty. I think it's enough for now on. I had lots of questions, but she also answered all of my questions. I didn't see any question coming from the chat box, so I'll leave the floor to you, Professor Chetty. If you have a few sentences, you can make some conclusion, and then I will give the floor to the Yüceloğlu to close the session, if it is possible.
No, I don't want to promote my book on displacement, dispossession in the modern Middle East, but there's a good chapter. You know that it was translated into Turkish last year.
Yeah.
So it should be available if anybody wants to read the chapters on the Circassians in particular, because I think that's a history that I was always surprised was not so much well known.
Yes.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me.
Professor Lulu, do you have anything to add, to contribute?
Thank you very much. I would like to thank one more time for accepting our invitation to our university, at least online. Next time, we would like to host you, as I said before, face-to-face on the stage. I believe that we will have good mutual understanding because of many reasons. And you have really very deep information, deep knowledge about the issue, these problems. And it was our privilege to host you here. And we would like to repeat it again in the future, as soon as possible.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you. Really my pleasure.
Thank you, Sun.
Our honor.
Okay, we can close the session. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you.